Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, people often ask me how I'm able to do this podcast every single day without ever sounding sick or down or having an off day. And I've had quite a few emails this week about this very topic, and I'm going to let you into a little secret. And that is I'm always 2 weeks ahead. So if I have one of those bad days, I simply don't record the podcast. And today, I feel especially energised, for example, because I've just come back from my holidays. And none of you will know this because the podcast episodes were scheduled in advance and I was able to switch off for a week, recharge my batteries and give you all the illusion that every day is a holiday, almost. And I mention this because today's guest is a much better man than me, because he was actually on holiday with his family as we went to record today's podcast, and he took 30 minutes away from his holiday to sit down and share his story with me. And his name is Mostafa ElSayed, and he's not your typical biotechnology CEO. Because after spending the first half of his career working for top architecture firms, all with the initial intent to make building structures easier with robots and automation, Automata was born. All from an observation that automation was not taking off in a wide range of markets. Because we've all seen the world of automotive manufacturing get transformed through automation. But other industries, let's say like pharmaceuticals and life sciences, were getting left behind. But of course, everything changed over the last 2 years with the arrival of the pandemic. And I don't like mentioning the P word too much on here because so many of those conversations have been had already. And I also don't want to reveal any spoilers about our conversation because there's just so much gold in there. So without further ado, buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening in the world, I'm going to beam your ears all the way to Spain, where Mostafa has very kindly taken a little break from his holiday to share his story with us. So, massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Hi, my name is Mostafa ElSayed. I'm a co-founder and the CEO at Automata Technologies, which is a London-based robotics startup where we work on automating biotech processes.
And I'd love to take you back in time for a moment before we start talking about the great work that you're doing. And that's, can you remember where your passion for tech came from, or just the moment that put you on the path you're on today, and how the worlds of architecture and biotech would end up colliding for you?
Sure. So, yeah, like you mentioned, I was originally trained as an architect. Some days I still think of myself as an architect. But yeah, I studied architecture way back in 2002. For those of your listeners who are architects, they know it's a very long education. It's a 5-year undergrad and a 2-year graduate program. So I finished my education around 2008, 2009. And actually at the back end of my education, I went to a school here in London called the Architectural Association, which is a graduate program focused on what is considered cutting-edge architecture these days, which is the intersection between design and technology. And I think that's where our fascination with technology started. You start to understand that technology is fundamentally an empowering thing, for the lack of a better word. Yeah. And it empowers various disciplines like design, for example. And then we went on, I say we, I'm referring to myself and my co-founder, Suryansh, who I met at school. We went on to work in an architectural practice in London called Zaha Hadid Architects. Again, for those of your listeners who know, it's one of the top architectural practices in the world, known for projects like the Aquatic Stadium for the London Olympics, and also the Serpentine Gallery in Hyde Park, or the Mathematics Gallery in the Science Museum. And for the lack of a better word, it's known for like funky geometry. And in an office of around 500 people, we were in a small group of 5, which was called the computational design team. And that's where really our fascination turned into practice, where our job was to figure out design problems using technology, most often programming. And that's where our fascination with technology started. And then that evolved into a fascination in automation, if you want to talk about that.
And when I first heard how you were linked to these iconic buildings, it was one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today. And as you said, it was that path that led you to Automata, which was born from an observation that automation was just not taking off in a wide range of markets. So can you tell me more about the story behind the company and the kind of problems that you set out to solve with technology from the outset?
Sure. So I guess for me and my co-founder Suryansh, we had this fundamental belief based on our experience at Zaha, like I was just saying, that technology is this empowering thing. But we also experienced this, we had this experience at the office where, like I was saying, in a company of around 500 people, there was perhaps 15 of us who were quote unquote empowered through the use of programming. And that was a funny experience because you see the ability you have once you're able to program and what the office would be able to do if the vast majority of the workforce was able to program rather than the vast minority, as was the case. And that's where our kind of mindset was born, which was technology is a good thing, but only if the majority can access it. And in the office, we had a few projects where we had to use industrial robotics. AKA automation. And that's when we started to realize, like, oh, if I thought programming was obtuse, automation and industrial robotics is 100 times more difficult to get a hold of. But we could see the potential of that kind of technology. And that's when we started to be like, oh, there's something here for us to kind of democratize, right? I think that word is very popular in the startup scene, especially for first-time founders, this word democratization. And for me and my co-founder, what that meant was what we saw as the problem was robotics was fundamentally too difficult to use, like I just mentioned. And B, what we later learned is that a lot of people don't even get on the path of learning how to use a robot because it's perceived as way too expensive anyway, even if you could use it. So the birth of Automata was basically just those two things coming together. Could we build an industrial automation platform that was exponentially cheaper to use for your standard mom and pop manufacturing outfit in the UK and could be deployed on the same day it was received rather than weeks or months trying to figure out how to use it or call in the experts. So that was kind of like the birthing moment of the company, those two realizations, which was around late 2015.
And there's been so much talk recently about how much the world has changed in the last 2+ years since the pandemic, etc. And if I look back before the pandemic, automation was almost like a dirty word. But I think now we are starting to see the value of it. It's completely changing. And I'm curious, how have you seen the world of things like automotive manufacturing get transformed through automation, but others like, let's say, pharmaceuticals and life sciences, we're staying behind? Because there's been such a big change in that area, hasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, the pandemic has changed a lot of attitudes towards automation. And there's this sentence a lot of us in the company we try to kind of design and deploy and run the company by, which is this idea of proof of concept is where automation goes to die. I don't know if that sentence makes sense, but if you go to a lot of these factories, whether they make cars, drugs in terms of pharmaceuticals, or even sandwiches, right? We've been to a lot of the large F&B outfits in the UK. Every one of these companies, literally every single one, has ran on automation proof of concepts, but very few of them have truly adopted the technology. And one of the idiosyncratic things about automation, which I guess is the same about a lot of technology, is it only matters if you deploy it at a meaningful scale. Right? It doesn't mean anything if you walk into a factory of thousands of people where you have two robots working away in the corner, right? Like we talk about that inside the company, like that's like selling 2 servers to Google. Like what have you done? Nothing. And that's what we've been seeing changing. This understanding that automation is a platform that requires you to rethink how your outfit or business works. And only then can you truly leverage the power of that technology. And B, we've seen people start to really undertake change management processes to bring in automation because, as you've said, the pandemic has really highlighted the fragility of our supply chains, in the West at least. And across the board, people have started to really consider how they can adopt automation to achieve the level of transformation we've seen in the automotive industry through robotics.
And fast forward to present day, and you guys are now providing software and hardware lab automation solutions that actually enable efficiencies and scale in labs, and ultimately working with some pretty big customers, including the NHS, for example. And just to bring some of that to life, do you have any use cases you can share just to help people listening anywhere in the world, how it might work in their world too?
Yeah, absolutely. So our journey into biotech and the life sciences for those your listeners who are familiar with the journey of startups is, like I mentioned, we founded the company in 2015, 2016, focused on the democratization of automation. And effectively for the next 4 years was this journey towards product market fit, right? Where would we find that first industry that would truly catapult our technology into the world? And, at the beginnings of 2020, that's when we started really making inroads with our technology in the biotech industry. So to give you an example, I can give you a couple. The one we did with the initial project we did with the NHS was fairly straightforward to a certain extent. It was a response to the COVID effort, of course, where we worked with the University Hospital Southampton Trust to massively scale up their capabilities to run their COVID testing program. So when we showed up, unfortunately, all of us know what the COVID test looks like now. It's a weird world. We all know what that looked like. So that you've probably done your nasal swab, put it into a test tube, put it into an envelope and shipped it off to some lab somewhere, waited a couple of days and you got your result. And on the back end, what that looks like is hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, depending on the lab, of these envelopes which show up to a laboratory every day. And, biology doesn't happen in test tubes. It happens in something called microplates. So imagine this small piece of plastic with 96 holes in it, in which you take a tiny fraction of that nasal sample and put it in that plate, and that gets the test run in it. And what our technology worked with the NHS to do is to use robotics to transfer the sample from the test tubes into those plates. So when we showed up, that lab could sample 7,000 to 8,000 tests a day. And 3 to 4 months later, once our technology was deployed, that lab was able to handle 75,000 tests a day. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scale that's achievable through the deployment of robotics. So that's kind of a clinical example of our use case. To give you a more forward-looking example of robotics in the life sciences, we're working with a certain charity in the UK, let's say, that works on cancer therapeutics. And there's this particular process called high throughput screening, which is very common in the discovery of drugs, which is basically how you screen for how a protein will work, not to get too deep into the science. And usually that process is very long. It could take up to 2 to 3 years, sometimes even 4 years, to identify what's called a clinical candidate from that process. And again, just similar to what I described to you in the NHS, you can imagine what would happen when you deploy robotics in that process. Suddenly, in the same 12 to 16 working day, you can run 10x more samples than you would have been able to if you're using lab scientists alone. So suddenly what could be a 4-year process could suddenly become a 2-year process. And, I hope your listeners understand that, shortening, an average drug takes 8 years to come to market, 6 to 8 years to come to market. If you can take away 2 years from that process just through the deployment of automation, that's a very exciting place to be. And not to mention all the other advancements that are happening through machine learning and other technologies that are continuing to shorten that process, as I'm sure you've heard with things like AlphaFold. So it's a really exciting space at the moment because there's this truly transformative adoption of technology, which is changing what scale means in discovery and research, which is therefore changing what it takes to bring a therapy to market.
And the scale there is just incredible that you've unlocked. And before you came on the podcast today, I was doing a little bit of research just to try and learn a little bit more about you. And one of the things that stood out was your recent partnership with the University Hospital of Southampton and NHS Foundation Trust here in the UK. Is that something you can expand on for anyone that missed that announcement around the partnership?
Sure. So that relationship started with that COVID lab I was just mentioning, where we demonstrated that massive scale up in a very short period of time. So, 4 months from 7,000 to 75,000 tests a day. So, whatever that is, a 10x increase in capacity. And that just kickstarted a whole set of relationships with that trust. And now has actually also transformed into further relationships with other NHS trusts back on the back of that success. So the relationship with University Hospital Southampton is a partnership commitment to continue to develop automation solutions in the microbiology space for the NHS with the express purpose to reduce time to patient response. That's the critical KPI within the NHS operations, which is how fast do you get back to a patient? And, like we were describing with the COVID lab, scaling up the number of samples a lab can handle easily changes how fast you can get back to a patient. And now also what's really exciting for us is by the end of this year, a lot of that success has translated to some leading NHS trusts as well here in London, for example, that work on, again, one of the NHS trusts we're working now with on the back of UHS is a leading cancer trust in London, in West London, where we're working with them on massively scaling up their genetic testing capabilities. And, to give you an idea why that's significant, genetic testing is the kind of next frontier of cancer detection. It's much more accurate, much more idiosyncratic form of cancer testing. It can give you a much more accurate, detailed description, therefore allows your doctors to give you a more targeted form of therapy rather than just a broad-based form of therapy. And traditionally, this was a cost problem and a volume problem within the NHS. And we're really excited to be working with this trust because, again, similar to what we did in COVID, hopefully over the next 6 months, we can show that we can make this incredibly economical and have a really quick time to patient response on a kind of frontier technology. And I think it puts the UK in a place to be actually a world leader in this kind of technology.
At the beginning of our conversation, we've been talking about how attitudes have changed toward automation and biotech and emerging technologies. But I'm curious, if we look across the landscape, what challenges are you seeing CEOs facing, especially in the biotech industry this year?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can answer that in two ways. I think the one that's more relevant is the one which is more UK-centric. I think the UK truly has an opportunity to become a rare opportunity to become a world leader in the biotech and life sciences. We have some of the best universities in the world, some of the best research labs in the world. A lot of your listeners will be familiar with the Oxford, Cambridge research areas that have produced some truly spectacular innovations in the life sciences and biotech. And I think we find ourselves as a country on the bleeding edge of these industries. We punch far above our weight as a country in these areas. And I think what a lot of the CEOs in this space are facing as a problem these days are actually very mundane operational problems. To give you an example, it's incredibly hard to get a research lab just in terms of real estate in an area like Oxford and Cambridge these days. A lot of the companies we work with, especially some of the younger startups in the space, struggle to get real estate, which is why sometimes they turn to people like us because we can do a lot more with a lot less, if that makes sense. Our automation is very space efficient. And they're also struggling to get access to talent, right? So there's actually a good pipeline of funding into the life sciences and biotech. So that's not just a massive struggle as compared to other industries, but the availability of talent and space, if we don't pay attention to this over the next 5 years, could really start to become a bottleneck in the pipeline of UK biotech.
And if I was to ask you to gaze into your virtual crystal ball and look into the future, I'm curious, how do you see the lab automation market changing and growing, and where do you predict it will move next? Is there anything that stands out to you or anything that you're monitoring closely?
Yeah, I think hopefully I'll give you a slightly idiosyncratic answer.
Yeah.
It might sound pedantic, but what we think is the next step, and it's not just us, we see ourselves as part of a cohort of many companies who think in this way, is biotech is about to start to really leverage this concept of tech bio. And there's a difference between a biotech company and a tech bio company. Automata thinks of itself as a tech bio company. And I'll try to illustrate what I mean by this by analogy. So, you might have had an acquaintance, a family friend, or a friend over the pandemic who started a small business, right? A lot of us did that. We saw this trend quite a lot. I had a friend who over the pandemic started a kind of t-shirt business, right?
Yeah.
And it's so easy these days to start a t-shirt business, right? Because you go get a Squarespace account, you go get a Shopify account, you get a Stripe account, and you get a micro-fulfillment account. And suddenly you have the back end of your business set up, right? Yeah. All you have to do is design the t-shirt and find a manufacturing partner. And then the rest of that technology stack takes care of your business for you, right? So if you remember that word I used right at the beginning of the interview, e-commerce has been massively democratized because of this e-commerce technology stack. And that's what's happening in biotech these days. And that's what these tech bio companies are. You can see a world where you use company A, B, C, D, E, and F. And hopefully Automata is one of those letters. And as a scientist, what we like to say at Automata is you take care of your molecule, we'll take care of the rest, right? Like you need to focus on the science. And there's these companies who think of themselves more as engineering companies. That's what we think of ourselves as, rather than bio companies that support and empower scientists to bring their innovations to market. Now, that could be automation, that could be software, that could be machine learning in the cloud, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly what it takes to start a biotech startup fundamentally changes. And I think that's what we're on the cusp of in the next 5 to 10 years, that we will massively democratize biotech innovations. And that's why I think you see a lot of people really excited about this idea that biotech and the bio space is the next large contributor to the economy over the next 10 years, right? That we're about to really change what could be done in the space due to the availability of technology.
And one of the other things I was reading about you guys is this capability first approach, and how a capability first approach to automation and how that will revolutionize the industry. So can you expand on that, and also maybe leave us with a few teasers about your big ambitions and plans for the future?
Sure. So again, I'll try to answer that capability question through an analogy, right? Yeah. So you have two things. You have a capability-centric approach, and you have something called a workflow-centric approach. And we believe that lab automation today is stuck in the workflow-centric approach. And to truly unlock the power of a lab, you need to transition over to a capability-centric model. So think of your kitchen at home, right? It's the most mundane space in your house, probably. But actually, that's a capability-centric space in your house. Because imagine you installed a kitchen that could only make pancakes, right? Like, regardless of how you used it, it could only make pancakes. That's a workflow-centric approach, right? At the end of the workflow, you get a pancake. In a lab, at the end of a workflow, you run a certain type of test, you run a certain sort of screen, et cetera, right? That's what we mean by workflows. But actually, with the same set of equipment in your kitchen, you can make a pancake in the morning, you can make a chicken roast at lunch, and you can make whatever you like, rice for dinner, right? And you're using the same oven, the same microwave, the same hot plate, etc. And that's what we think should be happening in labs. That you should think of your lab as a set of capabilities rather than instruments you stitch together to do the same job over and over. And that's where, to answer the second part of your question, what we're excited by in Automata is that we're the ones to lead that direction. And what we think the future looks like if we do this interview again in 5 years, what I'll be talking to you about, rather than, hey, we scaled up this lab by 10x, is we would be building things like we like to call black box laboratories, right? Which is, think of a room full of equipment surrounded by robots where, a scientist logs into his lab or her lab anywhere in the world and designs an experiment, runs it in that lab. And, the same lab in Gothenburg that they ran it on would give you the same results if it was run in the same lab in San Francisco or in Paris or in London, because they're the exact same lab deployed as these black boxes in these, let's say, pharmaceutical companies that anyone could program, right? So a scientist has the freedom to just program their experiment and not be an expert of automation. And they just say, run, and these black boxes take care of everything else. I think that's the future we imagine. Again, similar to Amazon, right? Like, you don't know what's happening on the back end for you to get your mouse, right? You just press order, a bunch of things happen on the back end in this black box, and a mouse shows up at your doorstep. And I think that's the future of lab automation. You just say, I've designed my experiment on one of these platforms. I want to run it, 36 hours later, 4 hours later, depending on your experiment, a data file shows up in your email, which doesn't matter which lab in the world you ran it in. It's just based on the availability of labs. And you get a reproducible data set, which is the foundation of science moving forward.
And before I let you go, I always ask the guests if they've got anything that has inspired them recently. That could be anything from a book that we can add to our Amazon wishlist, a song that we can add to our Spotify playlist, or even a documentary or something, just something that's sparked a little bit of thought in you. So is there anything that you'd leave everyone listening with today?
Yeah, sure. I think for if you remember the story I was telling you at the beginning of the interview, where for us the transition from architecture to technology was about trying to find a space that we could work in where we would feel a lot more inspired, a lot more empowered, and that our time meant something and working on something that we enjoyed. I think a lot of that was driven by this certain documentary I'm sure a lot of your viewers have seen on Netflix. It's called The Defiant Ones.
Yeah.
It's the documentary about Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine. And, it's a 5-part documentary. You can get through it over a weekend. It was really inspiring to us because it shows what can happen if, in this case, two people who really worked super hard on something, but they barely considered it work because they enjoyed it so much. And I know that's such a cliche narrative, but that documentary shows it so powerfully. And every time I watch it, it really makes you reinvigorated to just get to work, right? It's like, this is why you do this. This is barely work. You shouldn't feel like you're working. And, they've definitely reaped the rewards of their success and made a massive change in the world in a certain spectrum. And for me, that's a really, really inspiring story where you get to work on something you really enjoy, have an impact in the world, and then live a life at the end of it that, matches the amount of effort you've put into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I love that. That's something I will be checking out. I'm a big believer in if you find something you love, you never have to work again, even though ironically you are working more hours than you ever have done before. But if you love it, it just doesn't feel like it.
It doesn't feel like it. Yeah.
No. And for anyone listening to our conversation today, we'd just like to dig a little bit deeper on anything about Automata and everything that we've talked about. Where should they find you guys online? Contact your team if they've got any questions or just find any more information. What's the best starting point?
The best starting point's our website. It's automata.tech, TECH. And, we're always hiring and we have a variety of jobs. I think what's interesting for a lot of people who come work for us is that the vast minority of our company either has a biotech or robotics background. I think that's, again, just because of the way me and Suryansh have started the company. And if you want to learn more about what we do, I think our website's also the best place to start.
Well, I always say at the end of every episode, technology works best when it brings people together. But I love what you're doing here and how you're providing software and hardware lab automation solutions that enable efficiencies and scale in labs. And although that sounds incredibly cool, it's what that delivers. And we're talking about the benefits of automation to a number of disease areas, including things like prostate and cervical cancer screening. It's incredibly important. But more than anything, just a big thank you for taking the time to sit down and share your story with me today.
Well, thank you, Neil.
What a great guy. And I love the story about how his background in architecture brought him to where he is today. And discussing the challenges facing CEOs in the UK biotech industry and his views on how the lab automation market is actually changing and growing. And, of course, finding more information about Automata's capability-first approach to automation and what that could mean for the industry. But you've heard from me today and you've heard from today's guest. But I want to bring you into the conversation because I know wherever you're working, you will have seen some changes, some good, some bad. And I want to bring you into the conversation and share all these rich ideas. And maybe we can all learn a thing or two from each other and also work together on future solutions. So let me know your thoughts. Email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram @Neil C. Hughes. And there are a few videos on TikTok @Neil C. Hughes as well. I am working on trying to add more content to there. So if you do find us on that platform, give me a shout. And I cordially invite you to join me tomorrow where we'll do it all again with a completely different topic and a discussion around how technology works best when it brings people together. But that's it for me. So a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.